Imagine a massive, sprawling empire. It lasts for 2,000 years, and its government is constantly, obsessively, tearing up and redrawing the property maps of its own people.
It just begs the question, why?
Exactly. They call this whole thing the equal field system.
But here's the thing that, just stops you in your tracks.
The paradox.
The paradox. This system, even with a name like equal field, it didn't touch the vast, sprawling estates of those powerful land-holding aristocrats. Not at all.
So it only affected the commoners.
Right, the commoners, refugees, people who were really struggling to just make a living.
So if the equal field system wasn't actually about taking wealth from the rich, if it wasn't about some kind of real social or economic equality, then what was the strategic genius behind it?
Or maybe the long-term strategic necessity.
Right.
Why would this huge empire do these endless land adjustments for centuries?
It had to be more than just a tax scheme.
Oh, it was a complete institutional commitment. We're about to dive into the true heart of Chinese governance here. And it reveals this four-word philosophy that really explains everything.
A philosophy that dictated how the state kept itself stable for millennia.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to get past that surface definition of equality and find the system's real purpose.
I think the first hurdle for anyone looking at this is the name itself. When you hear equal field system, your modern brain immediately jumps to, post-industrial political ideas.
Right. You think of radical land redistribution, that classic slogan, strike the landlords and divide the land.
And you have to just throw that image out completely. The Juntian system was never about equalizing land rights or wealth in that way.
So what was it?
It was fundamentally a massive bureaucratic distribution engine. But, and this is the critical part, it only distributed one very specific type of asset.
Which was state-owned wasteland.
That's it. That is the essential distinction. It changes everything.
Because it means the system couldn't, and really didn't, challenge the huge, established, fertile, private lands owned by those powerful aristocratic clans.
Exactly. These clans were basically parallel power structures. And the state, especially coming out of these huge civil wars, just didn't have the military or political muscle to take their lands.
So the system wasn't revolutionary at all. It was more restorative and strategic.
It was. It acknowledged the political reality that the big elites were untouchable, for now at least, which means its real purpose had to be aimed at a totally different group of people.
The common people.
Absolutely. The fact that it couldn't touch the big landlords is the key to understanding its real strategic goal, which was all about stabilizing the masses.
To really get why the state was so desperate, you have to picture the scene. We're talking about China after the chaos of the post-Three Kingdoms era, the collapse of the Jin Dynasty. It was just a prolonged period of brutal civil war.
The reality on the ground was horrific. Infrastructure was gone, irrigation systems had failed. Huge areas of what used to be fertile farmland were just desolate.
But the biggest problem for the government wasn't even the land itself, was it?
No, it was the people.
They were refugees.
Displaced, constantly moving, trying to escape famine, conscription, violence. They were either hiding out in the mountains or, more importantly, hiding under the protection of the big local clans.
And those clans wouldn't be paying taxes on them.
Of course not. So the central government is staring at this fiscal and really existential nightmare. Land that's not being farmed means zero revenue. People who aren't on the census can't be taxed, they can't be conscripted, they can't be drafted for public works projects.
They were losing control. They had to stop the bleeding.
And fast. They needed a policy that could aggressively bind these scattered people back to the land. They had to get them farming again, producing again, and most importantly, get them registered on the state census.
And the wasteland was the bait.
It was the perfect bait. It was the only asset the state had in abundance that was, politically cheap to give away. It turned empty, useless land into a magnet for people.
And it's so interesting because the goals are strikingly similar to things we see much later in Western history. You think about the U.S. Homestead Act of 1862.
It's an incredible parallel.
The U.S. government wasn't breaking up southern plantations. They were giving away 160 acres of public land out west.
The underlying logic is identical. It doesn't matter if it's continents and centuries apart. In the U.S., they needed settlers to populate the West, build things, and frankly, solidify their claims against native populations and other powers.
And in China, they needed farmers to stabilize food production and solidify the central state's tax base against the power of the local clans.
In both cases, the state offers up public land 160 acres in America. about 100 money in China to anyone willing to work it.
It's genius, really. You're turning an empty public domain into stabilized, taxable, quasi-private wealth. You're literally creating a tax base out of nothing.
And the mechanics of the system, how they actually did it, showed just how much deep institutional thought went into this. It wasn't just a simple handout.
No, it was a calibrated system of incentives and duties, and it changed from one dynasty to the next.
Right. So let's start where it began, with the Northern Wei dynasty. They formalized this with incredible detail. Land grants went to anyone over 15.
And importantly, they gave it to women, too.
Yes, recognizing women was critical. In that kind of small peasant economy, the entire household is the economic engine. But they also got more granular. The size of the grant wasn't just based on how many people you had.
It was about your productive capacity.
Exactly. They even factored in how many slaves or oxen you owned when they calculated how much land you got. It was all about potential output.
And the land itself wasn't just one block. It was split into different categories, right? Which defined your relationship with the state. The first one was called open land, or lutin.
Lutin was basically a lifetime lease. It was not inheritable. So when you died, that land went right back to the state's land bank.
So the state is saying, we'll give you a way to make a living, but it's conditional. You have to stay on the census, pay your taxes, do your military service.
It's a non-transferable asset tied to civic duty. If you failed to meet your obligations, they could take it back. When you died, it got recycled to the next 15-year-old who needed a plot.
And then there was another category for the bureaucrats.
Yes, office land, or Jifan Chan. This land was granted to local officials based on their rank. But the harvest from this land wasn't sent back to the capital as tax.
It stayed local.
It stayed local.
Right.
It was used to directly fund the operating expenses of that office. Salaries, supplies, whatever they needed. It was a really clever way to decentralize the funding of the bureaucracy and keep government functioning even in remote areas.
Okay, so then we move forward to the Sui Dynasty under Emperor Wen. He makes some big changes.
He does. He formalizes the idea of permanent inheritable land. He calls it perpetual property land, or Zuyongdiao.
And that's a huge shift. The state isn't just offering a lifetime lease anymore. This is a genuine family asset you can pass down to your kids. Why would they give up their right to take it back?
Two big reasons. Stability and containment. For the average farmer, getting a piece of this Zuyongdiao along with their lease land gave them a much bigger incentive to stay put and really invest in the land long term. You know, dig a deep well, build terraces.
But for the powerful aristocrats and officials, it was a containment strategy.
Exactly. Emperor Wen basically drew a line in the sand. He said, look, I recognize your status. I'm granting you this much land as your permanent, legally protected property. Now that you have this official guarantee, you have no excuse to just grab more unregistered land.
It was an attempt to regulate their endless expansion, a trade-off.
It was an attempt to buy their compliance by giving them a guaranteed legal asset. It's pure institutional design, trying to solve a political problem with an economic incentive.
And for the commoners, what was the general amount of land they received?
The rule of thumb was generally one man receives 100 mud of land. And just for context, a mu is pretty small, a little less than a sixth of an acre. So we're talking about maybe 16 acres.
16 acres, which for a family using ancient technology is a viable farm. Enough to feed themselves and pay their taxes, but certainly not enough to become a local power player.
Not at all. Then finally, in the early Tang Dynasty, the structure is mostly the same, but they change the name. The open land, the lutain, gets renamed.
To mouth-share land, Kofun Tan.
And that name change is so fascinating, isn't it? It's much more evocative. It's emphasizing that this land is literally being distributed to feed the mouth of every single person in the family.
But the core mechanism is always clear.
Always. Distribution for stability, not equalization for justice. And the state always, always keeps that ultimate reversionary right.
So if the system was always limited like this, a distribution of wasteland, not a leveling of wealth, how do we get from that specific mechanism to the grand strategy behind it all?
We have to look past the mechanism to the philosophy that guided all of these institutional designers across every dynasty. The state wasn't just reacting to crises. It was guided by this profound ancient moral and political principle.
And this is the idea that explains why they were so obsessed with adjusting land instead of just, I don't know, collecting taxes in a different way.
Exactly. And it comes down to four crucial words. Wei Min Jie Chan.
Wei Min Jie Chan.
That's the North Star. It translates roughly as creating property for the people. This concept is the central pillar of the entire Chinese institutional worldview. It connects everything.
And this wasn't just some administrative goal, right? This was a moral imperative.
It was the moral justification for imperial rule itself, and it's rooted deep in Chinese political thought, specifically from the philosopher Mencius.
Mencius, who was writing centuries before the empire was even unified, he's the one who really defined the ruler's moral mandate.
He did. He insisted that any enlightened ruler must ensure the economic security of his people. He was very specific.
What did he say?
He said the people must have enough land and resources to serve their parents and to support their wives and children. They have to have enough to be full in good years and to just escape death in bad years.
That's a powerful idea. The ruler's legitimacy, his whole mandate of heaven, isn't just about military might or being divinely chosen. It's about economic competence.
It's about ensuring the people have that Jie Chan, that secure livelihood. Because only once that physical foundation is secure, only when people aren't starving, can the ruler then ask them to be good citizens and be loyal.
If the ruler fails at that basic level, the people are naturally going to turn to crime and rebellion.
It's like an ancient version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
It really is. You can't ask someone to worry about civic responsibility if they're stuck on the bottom layer just trying to find food and shelter.
So the state's fundamental job is to design the systems, like the equal field system, to make sure that bottom layer is met for everyone. If a dynasty fails to secure Wei Min Jie Chan, it loses the mandate of heaven. And you see this happen over and over again in Chinese history.
Right. So the Juntian system was the bureaucratic tool they used to proactively fulfill this mentioned mandate to rebuild the stability that had been lost for generations.
And if we look at the language again, especially that character Ji, it's very nuanced. It doesn't just mean to buy or to set up.
It means to institute, to design, to regulate. It implies a very intentional, constructed system.
This is so important. The policy is not charity. It's not about handing out grain when people are starving. It's about creating a robust, sustainable institutional design that enables self-sufficiency generation after generation.
So the state has to constantly regulate land ownership patterns to make sure that property stays within reach of the common farmer.
It requires constant monitoring and adjustment. And that's why the Chinese state was perpetually doing these land surveys and censuses. It's the mechanism they use to operationalize their own moral legitimacy.
So when we look at the equal field system as this outcome of Wei Min Jie Chan, we can start to see the practical goals it was trying to achieve.
And really, land adjustments from the very earliest systems to the later ones were always aimed at two things that support each other.
Okay, what are they?
First, maximizing agricultural production efficiency, given whatever technology they had at the time. And second, making the state's tax collection as fair and sustainable as possible.
Efficiency and fairness. Those are the two pillars everything rests on.
To really get the efficiency part, we have to go way back to the earliest organized land system in Chinese history, the well-field system, or Jingtian.
This was from the city-state era, long before the unified empire.
Right, and the name Jing literally looks like a tic-tac-toe board, a 9-square grid.
And that's how the land was divided up. 8 squares on the outside for 8 different families.
They farmed those for themselves. But the key was the central square. That was the public field, the Gongtan.
And everyone had to work on that central field together before they could go work on their own private plots.
It's very similar structurally to the European medieval manorial system. In Europe, the serfs had to work the lord's domain for a few days a week. In China, the public field was basically a tax paid in labor.
And it was efficient for its time. I mean, when you think about the technology, primitive tools, not a lot of animal power. Having everyone work together on that central state field was probably the best way to get a harvest in.
It pooled scarce resources, like oxen and plows. But like all agricultural systems, it was brittle. It broke when technology advanced.
During the spring and autumn period?
Exactly. The Jingtian system just becomes obsolete. You get the widespread use of iron farming tools, more oxen for plowing. Suddenly, the effort-to-output ratio gets way better.
And that big communal labor unit is no longer efficient.
Not at all. A small family unit led by a patriarch who can make quick decisions about planting and harvesting is now way more productive than that clunky 8-family collective.
So the small peasant family economy is born.
And the state has to adapt or face total collapse. So they formally replaced that old feudal ownership with the idea of ultimate royal ownership of all land. And they basically just acknowledged the small plots that the peasants are already farming.
And that means they have to change how they tax people.
You can't demand labor on a public field anymore. So they shift to collecting taxes based on land area. They called it taxing by the acre, liu mu, shui. It was a huge change.
So this context is everything. The equal field system, which comes hundreds of years later, was really just the government's tool to reestablish that optimized small peasant economy after it had been shattered by war.
That's it, exactly. It was a mechanism to distribute land so people wouldn't flee and hide under the tax-free umbrella of the big aristocratic clans.
Because if a local warlord could hide 1,000 farmers on his estate, that's 1,000 people not paying taxes to the central government.
And it's 1,000 potential soldiers for his private army. By offering state land, the Juntian system pulled that labor force back out into the open, made them taxable subjects of the state, and indirectly weakened the power of those clans. It was a brilliant solution to a deep political problem.
There's a quote from the historian Cheyenne Mu that I think just nails this. He said, "The equal field system is the well-field system under the prefectural system." It sounds a bit dense at first.
But it's the key insight. Let's unpack it. He's saying the structures were different. The old well-field system existed under feudalism, when loyalty was personal. The equal field system existed under the centralized, bureaucratic prefectural system.
But the spiritual substance, as he calls it, was the same. That core commitment to Wei Min Jie Chan, making sure everyone has a plot of land to survive, that's the constant, even when the political machinery changes.
Now, the equal field system as a specific policy, it did eventually run its course. After the Tang Dynasty, the state basically ran out of public wasteland to give away. The refugee crisis was over, the land was all claimed.
But that guiding spirit, that institutional North Star, it didn't die with the system.
Not at all. Later dynasties, like the Song, Yuan, and Ming, just found a different bureaucratic tool to do the same job.
The land surveys.
Exactly. They did these incredibly extensive land surveys to compile what they called fish scale registers. And it's hard to overstate the amount of work this involved. This was meticulous field-by-field surveying to create maps so detailed they looked like overlapping fish scales.
So even though the state wasn't actively giving out land anymore, the act of creating these centralized records was a way of acknowledging and protecting the peasant family's possession of their plots.
They were securing that livelihood, not through distribution, but through documentation. And that detailed record keeping made sure that taxing by the acre was fair and accurate. It was the same goal, just a different method.
Okay, so we've established the first major strategic goal was internal stability, making sure people could make a living. But there's a second one, isn't there? One that's about the very nature of state power itself.
Yes. Every single time the state adjusts land, whether it's giving it away or just surveying it, it reinforces one critical foundational principle.
That the monarch retains the ultimate right to the land.
The monarch holds the final, supreme property rights to all land under heaven.
And this is where, a modern Western listener might start to see this as just pure despotism.
And that's a fair reaction. I mean, ultimate monarchical ownership was definitely the source of a lot of abuse and tyranny. It was. But we have to look past the short-term abuse to see the profound, long-term systemic benefit this structure provided. It's what held the entire Chinese community together.
So was there any check on this power? What was stopping the emperor from just taking whatever he wanted?
The main check was that moral mandate we talked about, Mencius's principle. If the emperor used his ultimate title to unjustly seize land and starve the commoners, he was risking the mandate of heaven. He was inviting rebellion. The whole system was a bargain. I guarantee your livelihood, and in exchange, you accept my ultimate sovereignty.
So the idea of property back then was just ambiguous. It wasn't the clean private versus state-owned system we have today.
Not at all. Between commoners, it looked just like a private property system. You could buy, sell, lease land. It was a functioning market.
But as soon as the state gets involved, that boundary just dissolves.
Because the emperor always held that final say. The best modern parallel is really eminent domain.
Right. Even in modern democracies, the state reserves the right to take private property for public use, like building a highway, as long as they pay you for it.
The Chinese emperor held that ultimate right of eminent domain over every single piece of land in the empire. It was the fundamental legal guarantee of the state itself. It's what allowed him to mobilize resources on a massive scale without having to negotiate with hundreds of feudal lords.
But this ultimate ownership created a real tension for the emperor himself, right? He had these two conflicting identities.
He was almost schizophrenic, institutionally speaking. On one hand, he's the head of his private family, the dynasty. He's concerned with his own wealth and lineage.
But on the other hand, he's the representative of the entire national community, the public interest.
And historically, that tension often resolved in favor of the private interest, which led to corruption and the end of dynasties. But despite those failures, the systemic benefit of having that ultimate title was immense. It made sovereign power look a lot like modern national sovereignty.
To really see the genius of the Chinese structure, I think you have to compare it to its opposite, medieval Europe, where land followed blood, not the state.
The classic example is Aquitaine in the 12th century. This huge territory, a big chunk of modern France, was owned by Duchess Eleanor.
And when she divorced the King of France.
She took her entire territory with her. Then, in this incredible geopolitical move, she immediately marries his biggest rival, Henry II, the King of England.
And just like that, a huge piece of France becomes English territory.
The single marriage transferred half of France to the English crown as a dowry. And that one act planted the seeds for centuries of war. Territory is a personal asset. It could be transferred through marriage or inheritance, which constantly undermined any idea of national integrity.
It's the definition of feudal fragmentation. The stability of a kingdom depended on the personal relationships of a few powerful people.
Exactly. Now compare that to China. Could a Chinese princess, married off for diplomatic reasons, transfer her family's territory to her husband's country?
Absolutely not. It's unthinkable.
Because that ultimate title, that eminent domain, was held by the emperor, who symbolized the entire Chinese community. The land, no matter who was living on it, remained fundamentally part of the unified imperial system.
The genius is that this ensured the territorial integrity of China over the very long term. The master might change, a new dynasty takes over, but the territory itself remains whole.
And that unity, that secure sovereign framework, is what allowed the monarch to do everything else. To build massive public works, to govern internally, to defend against external threats. Without that ultimate title to the land, the whole system of Wei Min Jie Chan just couldn't work.
So the equal field system wasn't just about taxes. It was about using property distribution to reestablish national unity after a period of total collapse.
This is the foundation of everything.
So let's try to synthesize the true meaning here. The equal field system was not about economic equality. It was a deeply strategic institutional design, and it was guided by that philosophy, Wei Min Jie Chan, creating property for the people.
And that policy served two foundational strategic goals. First, it secured the livelihood of the population, which ensured stability and a fair tax base for the state.
And second, by always asserting the monarch's ultimate title to the land, it secured the territorial integrity of the entire empire. It guaranteed sovereignty against both internal fragmentation and external threats.
And that underlying commitment, that spirit, survived long after the equal field system itself was gone. It just found new tools, the fish scale registers, the land surveys, the acreage tax, to keep doing its job for centuries.
It really reveals a profound truth about imperial governance, doesn't it? The property system was their ultimate security mechanism. The state was willing to engage in these massive bureaucratic adjustments generation after generation just to prevent the kind of fragmentation that defined feudal Europe.
So if the entire institutional design of Imperial China centered on securing both the livelihood of its people and the integrity of its territory, what does that tell us about how the government truly saw its own citizens?
Were they just protected subjects? Economic units whose land could be negotiated away?
Or was the preservation of their livelihood, their jichan, the state's highest political responsibility?
And if it's the latter, how much stability are you, the citizen, willing to trade for the ultimate guarantee of property rights? Imagine a nation so fantastically wealthy, so secure, that its state-owned granaries hold enough food to feed every single person for 60 years.
60 years.
They have solved hunger. They have solved scarcity.
It really does sound like the peak of human civilization.
Yeah.
Right? The ultimate measure of peace and solvency. This is the Sui Dynasty.
Now take that image and shatter it. Because despite having all that food, all that money, and all that centralized power, this empire collapsed entirely.
Imploded.
It just imploded in a bloody chaos in less than 2 decades.
It's the great paradox of history. I mean, empires usually fall when the fiscal tank runs empty.
Right.
When they can no longer afford the military or the bureaucracy or the infrastructure.
Right.
But the Sui Dynasty, it proved the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Success can breed a very specific kind of fiscal blindness. Their failure wasn't about what they collected. It was about the violent, abusive method they chose to collect it.
That's right. And for too long, I think the narrative around the Sui collapse has been just completely dominated by character assassination.
Oh, absolutely.
all the gossip about Emperor Yang's megalomania and his personal failings, which was, conveniently spread by the very people who succeeded him, the Tang dynasty.
We're putting that whole soap opera aside.
We are.
Today, we are focusing on the ledger. This deep dive is about the physical balance sheet of human labor.
Yeah.
We're asking a pretty fundamental question.
Which is?
When an empire has staggering wealth, why does it choose to physically break its own workforce? And why did that overflowing treasury prove so utterly powerless to stop a revolution fueled by, well, pure human exhaustion?
So our mission is to dissect the fiscal mechanics and the astonishing human cost of this unchecked ambition. We want to explore precisely why even 60 years of grain reserves cannot save a state if its policies push its people past the point of physical survival. Okay, so before we even get to the collapse, we have to establish the context of their prosperity. Because when we say the Sui dynasty was rich, we don't just mean, well off.
No, not at all.
We mean they achieved a level of financial security that you rarely see in world history. And that's an audacious claim, so let's ground this in some hard evidence.
We have to. And we can actually set aside the historical chronicles written by the winners, by the Tang. The indisputable proof lies in the archaeology.
And the ground.
In the ground. The Sui dynasty centralized its economy around grain, which, in this agrarian context, was the ultimate measure of everything. It was currency, it was strategic reserve, it was power. And to manage all this, they built these monumental state granaries.
And we're talking about massive infrastructure projects, not just little silos, right? These are vast complexes.
Exactly. I mean, think of the Tai granary near the western capital, the Lugo granary,
right,
and the Hanjia granary at the eastern capital of Luoyang. These weren't emergency caches.
No.
They were strategic national reserves designed to buffer against any eventuality, war, famine, drought, for generations to come.
And the thing that really cemented this picture for us came much, much later. In 1969, right?
Yeah, it did. Archaeologists were excavating the Hanji granary site near Luoyang in what is now Henan province. And they opened a cellar, just one subterranean storage pit within this massive complex.
What did they find?
They found 1,400-year-old grain. It was carbonized, of course, but the volume was preserved.
So let's visualize that volume for a second. What did that single cellar hold?
Based on the remains, they calculated that this one cellar contained approximately 250,000 kilograms of grain.
250,000 kilograms?
250,000. To put that into perspective for you, imagine an enormous room, maybe 40 feet across, packed floor to ceiling with nothing but rice and millet.
And that's just one storage unit. It forces you to realize the sheer intimidating scale of the entire Hanjia complex.
Let alone all the other state granaries spread across the country. This is the ancient equivalent of Fort Knox.
Right.
But instead of ingots of gold, they were hoarding mountains of calories. This physical wealth signified absolute national solvency.
And the people living at the time, they knew it. What did the contemporary ministers estimate their total national food reserves were?
Their estimates were just astonishingly high. They believed that the packed warehouses held enough strategic reserves to feed the entire population, the commoners, the soldiers, the court, for 50 or even 60 years.
50 to 60 years. That just changes the entire calculation of the dynasty's collapse. This state wasn't fragile, it was incredibly resilient. It was sitting on a wealth foundation almost immune to market fluctuations or bad harvests.
Exactly.
So the question immediately shifts. If they weren't poor, how did they get this rich this fast?
What's fascinating here is that the speed of accumulation, it surprised even the founder, Emperor Wen. He reportedly asked his officials why they had so much grain.
He didn't even know.
He was baffled. He said, I've lightened taxes, I've spent a good deal on rewards for my officials in the military. How is this possible?
That points to some major systemic efficiency. This wealth wasn't accidental, it was institutional.
Precisely. We could break it down into three key institutional pillars. First, the successful centralization of political control.
Okay.
The Sui dynasty finally managed to suppress the powerful local aristocracy and the entrenched local tycoons who had dominated land and population for centuries.
Which fundamentally means they eliminated the powerful middlemen who used to skim off the top of the tax revenue.
Correct. The state gained direct control over land registration and the population census. This allowed them to tax the common people efficiently and broadly, which gave them a huge boost in revenue reliability.
Okay, so pillar one is control. The second pillar must be the administrative structure. You need a system that can manage wealth on this scale.
And they delivered. They delivered administrative innovation. The Sui established the 3 departments and 6 ministries structure. Now, for you listening, this might sound like some dry bureaucratic jargon, but this was a major step toward modern governance.
So let's unpack the function of that system. What did it actually do?
It created clear divisions of labor and responsibility. It moved away from systems where one powerful family or one official controlled everything. The 6 ministries handled key functions: personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and public works.
So it's specialization.
It's specialization. This structure concentrated resources efficiently, it reduced internal corruption, and crucially, it allowed the state to manage logistics and finance on an unprecedented national scale.
So better governance structure, check. Centralized land control, check. But wealth still needs to move. If all the grain is grown in the south, how do you get it to the capitals in the north?
And that's the third pillar, a logistics breakthrough. The widespread use of efficient land transport and the embryonic canal systems meant that grain and materials could be continuously transported to the national treasury.
That's a constant flow.
A constant flow. It eliminated bottlenecks and ensured an uninterrupted supply of wealth feeding those colossal granaries.
And let's not forget the crucial restraint shown by the founder, Emperor Wen. He understood the delicate balance required to maintain this whole system.
That is the most telling detail, and it really foreshadows the collapse. Wen was personally frugal, sure, but strategically, he was gentle with his greatest resource: manpower.
What did he do?
He actually raised the compulsory service age for corvée labor. That's the forced public service, from 18 to 21.
That 3-year window, it sounds small, but in an agrarian economy, that's massive.
It's absolutely massive. That extra time allowed young commoners to focus on productive agriculture, building up their own family's wealth, and at the same time boosting the overall prosperity that the dynasty was enjoying.
He understood.
He understood that a happy, productive farmer contributes more long-term wealth than a conscripted, exhausted laborer. He kept the tax handle light.
And that light touch is precisely what his successor, Emperor Yang, completely abandoned. So we've established the premise. The Sui Dynasty was not fiscally poor. They had the solvency to hire any army, fund any project, and buy any material they needed.
Anything they wanted.
Yet, Emperor Yang chose the cheapest, fastest, most lethal path available: mass forced conscription.
The issue was never the resources. It was the timing and the ambition. Yang wanted global recognition and massive internal infrastructure projects completed right now.
Immediately.
Immediately. And when ambition is too large, too immediate, it inevitably defaults to the most brutal, blunt instrument of state control, which is the direct conscription of human life.
What's so tragic is that Yang started his reign following his father's gentle principles. He raised the service age again, pushing it back to 22, and he even exempted women from certain taxes. He seemed to grasp the need for restraint.
But that restraint lasted only until his grand vision kicked in. Once he decided on big work, unprecedented construction and foreign wars, he had to pivot instantly. We can structure his self-destructive projects around the analysis of historian Lu Ximian, serving the 4 barbarians, and obsessive touring.
Let's start with serving the 4 barbarians. This sounds like necessary diplomacy and territorial expansion, but it quickly devolved into a fiscal catastrophe focused purely on image.
It was pure extravagance for reputation. Yang recruited the Hu people from the western regions to pay tribute and visit the capital. But the actual tribute was minor. The real cost was staging the performance.
The Potemkin village effect. They had to create an illusion of unlimited wealth for the foreign visitors.
An absolute illusion. Every single county and region these foreign dignitaries passed through was required to stage massive showy displays, endless feasts, clean streets, lavish gifts, the appearance of boundless prosperity.
And the cost of that.
To pay for this massive theater, local governments were completely bankrupted. They drained regional treasuries dry, all to project an image of power to a handful of foreigners.
It's the ultimate lesson in the vanity of state spending. But the cost was more than just showmanship. It involved real logistical strain. I know Yang induced the Western Turks to cede land.
Right. And territory is great geopolitically, but it requires continuous, immense logistical support. You need supply lines running thousands of miles from the interior to staff the soldiers and the new civilian populations guarding that land.
And those supply routes themselves became death traps.
They did.
How so?
Well, just imagine the thousands of commoners conscripted just to haul grain and supplies over harsh terrain. They were poorly paid, they were given poor rations, they had almost no medical care. Historical records indicate countless commoners just died by the roadside.
Wow.
From exhaustion, disease, and exposure. just trying to deliver goods to these far-flung outposts. That logistics chain was already bleeding the populace dry before the wars even started.
And then came the true fiscal hemorrhage.
Yeah.
The 3 successive campaigns against Goguryeo in Korea. This wasn't just a war. It was an exercise in national self-sabotage by conscription.
The scale is almost unbelievable. The military draft alone involved over 1 million fighting men.
1 million.
But as you pointed out, the real killer was the support labor. For every soldier on the front line, you needed 5 or 6 people just managing the logistics chain.
Just to keep him fed and armed.
Transporting grain, weapons, and supplies hundreds of miles north. So if you pull 1 million men for combat, and then you pull hundreds of thousands, potentially millions more, just to feed and supply them.
You are systematically vacuuming every capable male worker out of the agricultural sector.
The country was stripped bare. The fields at home were emptied, production halted, and families were left without the manpower needed to survive, all to feed this insatiable military machine whose primary goal was often prestige, not necessary defense.
So that covers serving the 4 barbarians. Now, let's look at obsessive touring, the construction projects. The Grand Canal is the most famous, but these projects were legion. And the core problem was the terrifying mortality rate, driven by sheer forced speed.
The projects themselves, like the canal, were brilliant ideas with long-term benefits. But Yang's projects were too many, too frequent, and executed far too fast. He pushed the workforce past any reasonable human limit. And this is where the historical data points become truly shocking.
Let's start with the building of the eastern capital, Luoyang. What does the data tell us about the human cost there?
The historical records detail that 2 million men were drafted for labor every single month for the construction of Luoyang.
Every month.
Every month. But the most horrifying statistic is the mortality rate. Nearly 40% of those laborers died.
40% monthly mortality. That means they weren't just building a city, they were running a meat grinder. The state was forced to conscript new, healthy workers constantly just to replace the hundreds of thousands who were dying from disease, exhaustion, or accidents every 4 weeks.
It was an attrition event disguised as urban development. These men were subjected to high labor intensity, terrible sanitation, inadequate shelter, and just brutal, unforgiving oversight. It demonstrates a system where human life was calculated as entirely disposable fuel to meet an impossible deadline.
And the pace didn't slow down. What about repairing the Great Wall?
In the 3rd year of the Dai era, over 1 million men were drafted specifically for wall repair. Another 200,000 were added the following year. And during the construction, historical records show that more than half of those laborers died.
More than 50% dead. That goes beyond simple neglect. That is state-sanctioned, forced exhaustion.
It is absolute system failure, driven by Yang demand for speed at any cost. And then, of course, there's the Grand Canal. It's rightly celebrated as the backbone of China's eventual north-south economic integration.
The 7th century equivalent of the interstate highway system.
Exactly, a brilliant idea.
Executed in a lethal manner.
Absolutely lethal. Excavation started in the 1st year of Dai, with over 1 million laborers immediately conscripted. The Tongji and Yangji canals, crucial segments of this vast waterway, were completed in just 1 year.
1 year.
Utilizing another million-plus laborers. The records are silent on the exact death toll, but they confirm countless deaths and injuries.
And this is the crux of the Sui Dynasty's undoing. They had massive stores of grain, they had the silver to pay, they had the solvency to hire professional labor, spread the project out over 10 years, provide good conditions, and maintain agricultural productivity.
Instead, they chose the cheapest, most violent, and fastest method. Forced labor at breakneck speed. This created the inevitable vicious cycle. For 13 years under Yang, there were massive corvée drafts almost every year, running overtime with no time limits.
And when the strongest laborers are gone, often never returning, the normal engine of wealth creation, the farms, it just stops.
Correct. You cannot have agricultural productivity if your entire labor force is digging canals for the state and dying in the process. The paradox is complete. The national granaries are overflowing, proving the dynasty's papal solvency.
But the actual people, the foundation of the agrarian economy, are spiraling into extreme poverty and starvation because they are physically unable to work their own land.
Yeah, they are starving while standing next to Fort Knox. This excessive annual abusive use of manpower was the critical reason the Sui dynasty, despite its overwhelming wealth, perished after only 38 years.
So the Sui collapse isn't just a historical anecdote about a bad emperor. It serves as the most spectacular warning sign about a fundamental fiscal flaw that plagued empires for 1,000 years. The reliance on mandatory, physical service, or corvée.
It's the ultimate lesson in the failure of governance. Corvée labor is structurally unstable because it ignores the economic imperative of productivity and triggers the deepest, most immediate resistance from the populace.
Let's frame this within the basic options an empire has to collect wealth. We call these the three tax handles.
Right. A state can try to tax commerce, so goods and trade. It can tax land property, harvests, or it can tax people poll taxes, head taxes, or direct labor.
And corvée.
Corvée, the direct conscription of manpower, is the most primitive, least evolved form of taxing people. It is the default setting for a new or desperate dynasty that lacks sophisticated financial management.
Why is this primitive tax handle so uniquely fatal compared to, say, a tax on the harvest?
Because it is a burden placed directly on the human body. It's on the physical source of all productive activity. Unlike an abstract financial tax, which is just numbers on a page, corvée is physical pain felt immediately.
It's visceral.
It's visceral. It causes debilitating illness, injury, and often death. This creates a powerful sense of fear and terror among the populace, which instantly mobilizes violent resistance.
Let's use that modern analogy again. If the government demands 30% of your bank account, you comply, however reluctantly.
Right. But if the IRS instead demanded that you personally come to the state capitol to lay bricks for 3 months every year, regardless of how rich you are, that forced service physically exhausts you, ruins your long-term health, and most importantly,
it destroys your ability to do your actual job, the one that generates wealth in the first place.
Exactly. So the state gets the work done, but at the catastrophic cost of crippling the long-term, self-sustaining wealth production of the entire country. The Sui Dynasty was wealthy enough to avoid this choice, yet they chose it anyway.
They chose short-term speed over long-term stability.
They did. And this instability is why, when you look at imperial history, the general arc of civilization is defined by the state constantly trying to evolve away from this physical service requirement.
It was a long, messy, thousand-year process of evolution full of relapses, but the movement was always toward replacing forced labor with collected money that could then be used to hire professional labor.
This shift to what's called commutation is the critical institutional step. It's fundamentally more cost-effective for the state to collect money and hire a trained workforce than to drag a reluctant, unskilled farmer off his field and watch him die of exhaustion.
Where do we first see this shift happen institutionally in Chinese history?
Well, you can look at the Han Dynasty. They introduced gongfu, which was a commutation tax. This was a landmark reform because it essentially gave people a buyout option.
So pay a fee, and you're off the hook.
Pay a fee, usually in grain or goods, and you were largely excused from the obligation to physically serve the state.
That sounds like a sophisticated step, but you mentioned relapses.
The relapses always coincided with war and chaos. During the instability of the northern and southern dynasties, when the state desperately needed manpower for military or defense, and when the common people had no accumulated wealth to pay those buyout fees.
It came back.
Physical corvée labor became a necessary, brutal burden again.
So the Sui Dynasty essentially institutionalized a desperate wartime measure during a period of unprecedented peace and wealth. They learned nothing from the Han.
They repeated the worst mistake.
Yes.
And the succeeding dynasty, the Tang, learned the lesson the hard way from the Sui collapse.
What was the Tang's immediate response to avoid the Sui disaster?
The Tang refined the commutation process further. If citizens didn't want to serve physically, they could pay their obligation in textiles, usually bolts of silk or hemp cloth.
Why textiles?
Textiles were valuable, they were easily stored, and they were transportable. Institutionally, the heavy burden of physical corvée virtually disappeared. It was a clear and immediate societal response to the excesses of yang.
But the underlying taxing people concept never completely died. It just resurfaced under different bureaucratic names later on.
Precisely. The Song and Ming dynasties saw the complexity return. The Song, for example, assigned labor based on asset status richer households had a greater obligation for service. But even here, the reform trend held.
What happened then?
Wang Anqi's famous reforms converted these mandated labor burdens into hired help, paid for by money collected from the populace.
So it keeps happening. States keep realizing they should tax the wallet, not the body. What was the next major refinement?
That came during the Ming dynasty, with the landmark reform known as the single whip reform. This was crucial because it simplified the chaos of multiple tax obligations, land tax, labor tax, silver tax, special levies, into one single point of extraction.
And it folded most of them into the land tax.
Primarily. So the single whip reform essentially takes the concept of the labor service tax, which the Ming called yin chai, or silver service, and transforms it into a line item on your property tax bill.
That's the core concept. It was a huge administrative modernization. It moves the burden away from the physical person whose health and location are difficult to track onto the land, which is an immovable, quantifiable asset.
Which is fiscally superior and less painful for the commoner.
And this idea, this concept of converting a physical obligation into a monetary buyout, it is not unique to Eastern history. It sounds exactly like what happened in the West.
We see that parallel in the American Civil War commutation fee of 1863. If a man was drafted into the Union Army, he could pay $300 to the government to hire a substitute and avoid military service.
It's the same mechanism.
It's the same basic socioeconomic mechanism, transforming a mandatory physical obligation into a monetary tax, offering a buyout fee. It's the natural evolution of governance, trying to maximize revenue with minimum public friction.
But the complete, definitive elimination of the requirement for physical service in China didn't happen until much, much later.
That's right. It wasn't until the Qing dynasty, well into the 18th century, that the final and most powerful reform occurred. Tanding Rumu.
Merging the head tax into the land tax.
That's it. That sounds like the final blow to the primitive tax handle. What was the significance of that merger?
Well, this took the dingyan, the personal silver tax levied on every person, literally the tax on your head, which was the remnant of the ancient corvée obligation, and absorbed it entirely into the land tax.
And once that personal physical tax base was extinguished,
the requirement for direct physical service was institutionally gone forever. It's no longer about counting people, it's about counting acres.
Exactly. And the societal impact was recognized by later thinkers as monumental. Liang Qichao, a prominent intellectual, described this specific reform, Tanding Rumu, as marking the elimination of slavery in China.
Wow.
It shows how profoundly the physical labor requirement was tied to the suppression of personal freedom and livelihood.
So, the collapse of the Sui Dynasty serves as the most spectacular, terrifying fiscal alarm in history. A rich state destroying itself because it chose the most painful, primitive, and direct way to extract labor from its people, even when it had the wealth to pay for it.
The lesson echoes through 1,000 years of governance. The method of fiscal collection must always be mindful of human cost. The Sui had 60 years of food security, but it chose forced conscription, shattering its economy and triggering revolution.
Extreme ambition combined with the most physically burdensome tax method is a recipe for catastrophic self-destruction, no matter how full your treasury is. That wealth meant nothing when the people themselves were treated as disposable tools.
The Sui dynasty wasn't fiscally poor. It was fiscally stupid. It had the wealth to pay for labor, but chose the cheapest, most violent method of collection, shattering the very foundation of its agrarian economy and triggering resistance.
Besides the direct consequence of excessive corvée labor and the resulting starvation, what other long-term consequences of Emperor Yang's ambition, like the constant military failure or the logistical nightmares, do you think ultimately contributed most acutely to the fall of the incredibly rich Sui dynasty?
Imagine stepping into, let's say, the year 700 AD, but you're not in the rugged, fragmented West. You're in Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Tang dynasty.
The center of the world at that time, a city of over 1 million people.
1 million people. And it's this beacon of cosmopolitan power, incredible wealth, and something really surprising. Just overwhelming safety.
You're describing what we call the High Tang. It's the golden century. An empire so successful, so utterly stable, its currency was the standard across Asia. Its poetry is, well, it's immortal.
It really does seem like the absolute pinnacle of human achievement. But here's the puzzle we're diving into today. How could this dynasty, at the very, very height of its power and all this visible prosperity, have a financial system that historians basically call fragile from the very beginning?
And that is the core contradiction. This deep dive is all about the economics of the early Tang, specifically this really integrated system of land, tax, and labor. We have to look past the glorious facade.
To see the cracks in the foundation.
Exactly. To analyze the fatal, almost mathematical design flaws. It's like a ticking clock hidden inside the machinery, making its eventual collapse, or at least a temporary one, pretty much unavoidable.
So before we get to the collapse, let's just live in that golden age for a minute. I think we need to feel just how extraordinary that sense of security really was.
It's important
Yeah.
because this wasn't just, a powerful kingdom. It was an entire world system that was humming along at a peak efficiency we almost never see in history.
Magnificent is the word that comes to mind.
It was. The phrase prosperous Tang makes you think of art and culture, which was there, of course. But the real marker of success was this incredible administrative and logistical stability.
And we have actual evidence for this, right? Not just poems.
Oh, absolutely. Specific accounts that detail this level of trust between the state and the average person, that is. It's almost breathtaking to read.
The one that completely floored me was the account from the New Histories of the Tang about the Zhenguan era.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The 1,000-mile journey.
Exactly. Because a person could set out on a journey of 1,000 miles, which is just a massive undertaking back then, and not even need to carry their own food.
Stop and think about what that actually means. Forget public catering. A 1,000-mile journey without rations means you, the traveler, trusted, absolutely trusted, that every local inn, every market, every little rest stop along the way would be open.
And stocked. And safe.
And safe. It proves exceptional public safety, so no bandits. And critically, it shows a highly sophisticated, standardized transport and distribution network. The economy was just humming.
That level of logistical confidence it's such a powerful way to measure success. The state wasn't just keeping people from killing each other, it was efficient enough to guarantee supplies everywhere.
And you could measure that success in prices. Look at Emperor Xuanzang's reign, which was really the peak of the peak. The records are clear. Most common households had huge grain stockpiles.
Not just for a season.
No, enough to last for several years. And this huge surplus, naturally, it pushed market prices for grain down to historical lows.
When you remove that basic, fundamental anxiety of existence, where's my next meal coming from? When you remove that for most of your population, you've done something revolutionary. That is the definition of a golden age.
Absolutely. The whole society's focus can shift from just surviving to culture, art, administration, expansion. And, this level of stability, it really needs a historical parallel to give it context.
For a Western audience, the immediate comparison is the famous Pax Romana.
Precisely. The promise of the Pax Romana was that a citizen could travel from the cold frontier of Britain all the way to Syria, and you were always under the umbrella of Roman law and military protection.
A single, secure system.
The Tang dynasty delivered the Pax Sinica, a period where huge internal trade routes and safe passage were guaranteed across a territory that was, frankly, much larger and more densely populated than Rome's.
So that journey of 1,000 miles, unarmed, and not even carrying your own food, it's the perfect soundbite for the Pax Sinica. This was a system that just worked.
It appeared to work flawlessly on the surface, but this is where we have to confront the paradox. This celebrated, powerful, safe empire, this towering golden building, was resting on fiscal foundations made of sand.
The core mechanism was flawed.
The very mechanism that financed all that peace and prosperity was structurally unsound. It was incapable of supporting the empire's own development beyond really the immediate generation.
So the stability itself was masking a deep, deep instability. It was a golden cage. How deep did these flaws actually run?
To see the fragility, we have to pull apart the three systems that formed the early Tang's entire infrastructure. They were designed to be one machine, a single cohesive contract between the state and its people.
And I'm guessing if one part of that contract failed, the whole thing came crashing down.
The whole thing. That's why we call them the triple threat. They were completely inseparable.
Okay, so what are they?
First, you have the way land was distributed, the equal field system, or Juntian. Second, how the government got its revenue, the land, tax, and labor system, the Zuyongdiao.
And the third?
The military, the militia system, or Fubing.
Now, I understand that many historians see this whole integrated model not as some brilliant innovation, but almost as a step backward, a regression to an older, less sustainable idea.
That is the crucial insight. For centuries before the Tang, the ideal in Chinese finance was to tax land. Tax it based on its size, its value, how productive it is.
Which seems logical.
It is, but it's administratively very difficult. So the Tang system was a compromise. The new idea was, first, we grant you the land, and then we tax you, the person who holds it.
So even though it looks like it's about property, it's really about counting heads.
Exactly. It fundamentally operated on the older ideology of taxing people. A poll tax, a tax on every adult male just for existing. And historically, that is always a recipe for disaster.
Let's break down how that compromise worked then. Starting with the foundation, the equal field system. What was the promise the state made?
The promise was very specific, and it sounded incredibly generous. The state would allocate 100 mues of land to every single adult male.
100 mu. This was the state basically guaranteeing you a livelihood.
That was the idea. But, and this is critical for why it failed later, not all of that land was the same.
Okay, how was it divided?
Of that 100 mu, the vast majority, 80 mu, was called personal share land. Think of it like a temporary lease for your lifetime. When you died, that land was supposed to go back to the state.
So it could be redistributed to the next generation of young men.
Right. It was supposed to be the state's circulating capital, the government's big pool of land.
And the other 20 mu.
That was the prize. That was the perpetual or hereditary land. This 20% was the real asset. It belonged to your family forever. You could pass it down. This was meant to build generational wealth and encourage people to invest in their property.
So the state keeps control of 80% to ensure fairness, but it gives up 20% as an incentive. It sounds like a pretty smart political compromise, actually.
And the system had another vital job. It funded the entire bureaucracy, the nobility. Officials were also granted huge tracts of land based on their rank, sometimes thousands of mu.
And the income from that land paid for local government operations.
Yes, but here's the key problem. That land was taken out of the public pool permanently. It was hereditary. So right from the start, huge swaths of the best land were being removed from the system that was supposed to keep redistributing it to the peasants. We have to remember that point.
Okay, so the state grants the land. Now I want something back. This brings us to the land tax and labor system, the Zuyongdiao. This is where the whole economy of stuff really comes into play.
It is. It's finance based on tangible goods, not on coins or abstract currency. And this is the part of the system that would just become too clumsy, too inefficient to manage during a long period of peace.
So let's break down its three pillars. First up is Zu.
Zu was the grain tax. Every year, you paid a certain amount of grain, and it was calculated based on the number of registered adult men in your household. This fed the government, the capital, and the army.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
Second is Diao.
Diao was the textile tax. Every single household had to pay a set amount of silk or maybe hemp or cloth if you were poorer. This provided the raw materials for everything from the emperor's robes to military uniforms.
And the last one, Young, the labor part.
Young was the corvée labor. This was your service obligation. A mandatory number of days, every adult man had to work on public projects, building roads, fixing dikes, digging canals.
But there was an out, wasn't there?
There was. And it's interesting. You could pay a substitution fee, but you didn't pay it in cash. You paid it in more textiles, more cloth.
We really need to pause on this because it's so alien to how we think about taxes. We just transfer numbers electronically. For them, this was a massive physical undertaking.
It was. It wasn't a bank transfer. It meant you, the peasant, had to deliver literal, heavy, bulky goods.
So try to imagine it. You've got to load up your cart with, say, 200 pounds of grain that you've just harvested.
Then you have to haul it, maybe for days, to the county seat. And then you also have to deliver a 20-foot bolt of silk that you and your wife spent weeks weaving.
And you're not done. Then you have to stay for 20 days and do back-breaking labor, or hand over even more of that precious fabric just to buy your way out of it.
The logistics are just staggering. The state had to collect, verify the quality, store, and then redistribute literal mountains of grain and textiles.
Which feels like a core reason the system would fail in peacetime.
It is. The complexity and the cost of material-based finance are immense. Grain spoils, textiles get moldy. You need this huge infrastructure. Thousands of granaries, warehouses, and an army of bureaucrats just to prevent corruption and theft.
And you compare that administrative nightmare to just collecting silver coins.
There's no comparison. A system that might be useful in a very primitive economy or during a war became this massive, inefficient anchor holding back the prosperous, developing Tang economy.
Okay, so the tax burden was both physical and administrative. How did this all connect to the third leg of the stool, the military, the militia system, or Fubing?
The Fubing system was, in theory, brilliant. It was a way to have a huge, dedicated army that was perfectly integrated into the agricultural economy.
How did that work?
A militia soldier received his 100 land grant just like everyone else, but, and this was the huge incentive, he was exempt from all those crushing Zuyongdiao taxes and labor duties.
So that's the ultimate trade-off.
Yeah.
You agree to serve, and you're freed from that heavy material burden.
Correct. You farm your land most of the year, you train in the off-season, and you march to war when you're called up. But, and this is the fatal cost assumption, the Fubing soldier was required to provide his own military equipment and supplies when he was deployed.
A bring-your-own-gear army. Why would a state that powerful do that?
Because it was cheap. It was a way to maintain a massive military on paper while avoiding the colossal expense of manufacturing and issuing armor, weapons, and food for hundreds of thousands of men. The state just assumed that the tax exemption and the land grant would be enough for the soldier to cover those costs himself.
An assumption that would come back to haunt them.
It would doom the entire system the moment real, lasting peace settled in.
So we have this incredibly complex, interlocking system. The state guarantees land, the people guarantee taxes in the form of stuff, and a part of the population guarantees defense.
And the core flaw is that this whole intricate contract, this machine, couldn't actually withstand the very thing it created, a long period of peace and prosperity.
Let's start with the foundation then. Why did the equal field system, that beautiful promise of 100 moves for everyone, why did it crumble? It just seems mathematically impossible to keep going.
It really was. It was a beautiful idea, but an unsustainable fantasy. And there were two forces that just combined to destroy it. The first was the unavoidable reality of land concentration.
But how could land concentrate if 80% of it was supposed to go back to the state when someone died?
It happened through both legal and, more importantly, illegal means. Legally, a really skilled or lucky farmer could use their extra wealth to buy up more of that 20% of perpetual land from their neighbors.
Okay, that's just natural accumulation.
Right. But the real problem was illegal. It was powerful local families, regional nobles, government officials who used their influence to just annex land. They exploited people's guts, forced sales, used outright corruption to gobble up huge estates and take that land out of the public sphere for good.
And the central government in the capital was probably too far away or too reliant on these local elites to stop them.
Exactly. And on top of that, you have to remember the state itself was constantly granting huge, new, hereditary estates to its own top officials and nobles as rewards. So this pool of circulating land was just shrinking and shrinking from all sides.
And then the second force you mentioned was population growth. That should be a good thing, a sign of success, but you're saying it mathematically broke the system.
It was the death blow. The Tang dynasty saw this massive demographic boom under the Pax Sinica. More peace, more food means more people. So every single year, more and more young men were coming of age and turning up at the local magistrate's office, demanding their promised 100 middles of land.
And the state's supply of that land was dwindling.
Dwindling fast. Think about the math. As the population grows, the amount of that privately held perpetual land, the 20 more everyone gets it, it balloons generation after generation. It's locked into private hands.
Which means the state's only resource, that 80 mil of personal share land that's supposed to be returned and recycled.
That pool is getting smaller and smaller because of land concentration and corruption, and the demand on it is getting bigger and bigger. Inevitably, you reach a point where the state simply runs out of land to distribute.
So the government becomes insolvent, but its currency is land. It can no longer deliver on the most basic promise of the entire system.
And when you look at it that way, the system starts to look less like a fair social contract and more like a massive Ponzi scheme.
That's a really sharp parallel. Explain that. How does it work like a Ponzi scheme?
A Ponzi scheme means a constant flow of new investors to pay off the old ones. Here, the young men coming of age are the new investors, and they're promised a payout of 100 mills of land. The capital used to pay them is supposed to come from recycling the personal share land from the people who died. But when the state can no longer get its hands on that recycled capital because it's been taken by elites or there's just not enough to go around, the scheme collapses. The state can't pay out.
And the most infuriating part must have been that they couldn't deliver the land, the foundation of the whole deal, but they absolutely kept demanding the tax revenue, the Zuyongdiao.
Precisely. And that is the exact moment when prosperity turns into a protection racket. When you run out of land to give, but you still demand the taxes, the government has lost all moral and legal authority.
So you have peasants who received maybe 10 mows of land or no land at all, but they're still being taxed as if they owned the full 100.
That's what happened. So what do? The tax burden is impossible, the social contract is completely broken, and the local official is still banging on your door for his grain and his silk.
Yeah.
You disappear. The common people took the only logical path. They chose flight. They abandoned their little plots, their villages, and they became vagrants, refugees. They just vanished from the official government registers.
And this is what triggers that fatal, vicious cycle of collapse.
A complete death spiral. Imagine you're a local magistrate. You have a tax quota to meet, and it's based on the number of people registered in your county last year. But now, 30% of your population has fled.
You still have to send the same amount of grain and silk to the capital.
You do. And the central government doesn't care about your excuses. So local officials did the one thing that guaranteed the system's destruction. They apportioned the tax debt.
Meaning they took the taxes owed by the families who had fled.
And dumped it all onto the few remaining law-abiding households who had stayed behind.
So the honest farmer who did the right thing suddenly sees his tax burden double or triple overnight. It's a punishment for being a good citizen.
And it becomes a swift, direct incentive for him to flee immediately. Why stay? So more people flee, which means the tax burden on the handful of people left goes up again exponentially. The tax base just evaporates.
Not because of a recession or a famine, but because the government's own administrative policy is destroying its population.
While this is happening, the military wing, the Fübing system, is collapsing for a completely different reason. It was dying from peace.
Right. The whole structure was built for a world of constant short-term warfare, where you had a chance to get loot or glory to justify the cost.
But under the long Pax Sinica, that whole calculation just flipped on its head. The cost-benefit ratio became toxic.
The soldier still had his land grant and his tax exemption, but as you said, the land grants were becoming impossible to get, and the tax burden was becoming insane anyway.
But the obligations of being a soldier were still immense. Long-term peace meant long-term garrison duty. You could be sent to the frontier, far from your farm, for 6 months, a year.
Right through the harvest season.
Exactly. You still had to go to mandatory training. And critically, you still had to maintain and purchase your own expensive military gear.
And we're not talking about small costs here. This is armor, swords, bows, arrows, maybe even a horse.
These are huge capital expenses for a peasant farmer. The time you lost from your farm for training and garrison booty, plus the cost of your equipment, could easily wipe out your entire year's profit.
So it became economically irrational to be a soldier. You were literally paying for the privilege of defending a state that was no longer holding up its end of the bargain.
People simply stopped volunteering. They deserted their posts. They used their exemption status to hide from the census takers. The Fübing system, which was built on this idea of the patriotic citizen soldier, died because it made no economic sense.
And the state then had to,
Yeah.
what, hire professionals?
They had no choice. They had to pivot to a centralized, expensive, professional standing army, which of course put even more strain on the already collapsing material-based tax system. It was a perfect storm.
The complete failure of all three systems, Juntian, Zuyongdiao, and Fübing. It feels like more than just a problem for one dynasty. It feels like a huge lesson in history.
It's one of the most profound lessons in imperial finance. This wasn't just a Tang dynasty issue. It was the final, definitive proof that the entire ideology of taxing people, the head tax approach, was a political and economic dead end for a large, complex state.
It was the end of an era.
Completely. We mentioned the ideal was always to tax the land's value. The Tang compromise was grant the land, count the men, tax the men. And they proved, with catastrophic results, that this model is mathematically unsustainable against basic population growth and human greed.
And it's a lesson that history teaches over and over again in different places at different times.
Yeah.
The moment your tax system is based on existence rather than wealth or production, you build instability right into the foundations.
And you don't even have to look back 12 centuries to see the exact same thing play out. There's a crystal clear parallel with the downfall of the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in 1990.
Because of the community charge,
Universally known as the poll tax.
which was a flat tax levied on every single person, regardless of their income, their assets, their property. It was a direct tax on existing.
And the mechanism of its failure was identical to the Tang. The tax was obvious, it was immediate, and it was painfully regressive. It hit the poorest people the hardest, and they just could not understand why they should pay the same amount as a millionaire living in a castle.
And the result was mass public resistance, riots, and just widespread refusal to pay.
The taxpayer simply disappeared from the records. People refused to register to vote just to avoid the tax. It perfectly mirrors the flight of the Tang peasants centuries earlier.
It's an iron law of state finance, then. Taxing people just for being alive is politically toxic.
It's a universal lesson in statecraft. You cannot make existence itself the core taxable event in a functioning society. The resistance it creates is just too profound, and it forces the state to realize that a sustainable tax base has to be anchored in something tangible and measurable.
Like land acreage or commercial profit or accumulated capital.
Things that reflect an ability to pay. So the total implosion of the Zuyongdiao system wasn't really a choice for the mid-Tang emperors. It was a desperate necessity that forced them, finally, to embrace a sustainable model.
It forced that monumental pivot toward a system based on land acreage and wealth, regardless of how many people lived on it.
And that pivot gave birth to the famous two-tax law, the Liang Shui Fa, and that forever shifted Chinese imperial finance away from the personal poll tax model.
So what's the big takeaway for us, watching economies today?
I think understanding the Tang's fiscal failure helps you see the difference between a system that's a brilliant, maybe even necessary short-term political compromise like the Juntian system was for a generation, versus what is a viable long-term foundational structure for a complex state.
And the Tang proved that you can have a fatal structural weakness that is completely invisible during a period of peak power.
It can be hidden by that power. The strength on the surface masks the weakness underneath.
That's the real sting in the tail of this story. We started this whole deep dive with that traveler, walking 1,000 miles in complete safety, surrounded by overflowing granaries and military might.
The picture of success.
Only to realize that the economic foundations under his feet were already crumbling, and that the collapse was being accelerated by the very peace and population growth that made his safe journey possible.
Indeed. The celebrated Zuyongdiao system collapsed precisely during the High Tang, the absolute peak of the dynasty. So what does that relationship really tell you about the nature of structural health? It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often today is our celebrated prosperity just masking fatal design flaws that are mathematically guaranteed to fail? We're just waiting for the right pressure to hit that tipping point. The gold is only ever as strong as the sand it rests on.
Imagine a dynasty collapsing. Total chaos. The capital is sacked, the imperial family is scattered, and centuries of order just fall apart. So when the smoke clears, a new regime takes power, and what's the very first thing they do?
They tear down the old system. Always, especially the taxes.
Exactly. It's the iron law of dynastic change, right?
It is. Taxes are the ultimate political statement. A new emperor proves they're legitimate by, abolishing the burdens of the regime they just overthrew.
But today, we're diving into a historical paradox that completely defies that law. We're looking at a single fiscal decree, a tax law, born in the darkest hours of the collapsing Tang dynasty in 780 AD.
And this law didn't just survive the fall of the Tang.
No.
It outlived the Song, the Yuan, and the Ming dynasties.
It's just unbelievable.
We are talking about a tax structure that somehow became immortal. It persisted for over 1,000 years through revolutions, foreign invasions, total institutional collapse. It became the bedrock, the unshakable economic constitution of Imperial China, no matter who was sitting on the throne.
And it has a name.
It does. The two-tax law. The Liang Shui Fa.
A millennium of mandatory, continuous fiscal reality. That level of staying power, it demands that we look closer. This wasn't just some minor tweak to a tariff.
No, this was, and I think this is the best analogy for it, this was the Napoleonic Code of Chinese finance.
That's a powerful comparison. Unpack that for us.
Well, think about it. The French Civil Code, Napoleon's code, it survived the fall of his empire, right?
Okay.
It went on to lay the legal foundation for modern Europe.
Okay.
The Liang Shui Fa did the same for China's economy. It outlived 4 major imperial houses and set the economic foundation for the next 10 centuries.
So our mission today is clear. We need to get inside the Liang Shui Fa. What did it actually do? Why was it so necessary? What kind of crisis could possibly force its creation?
And maybe the biggest question of all, how did it fundamentally reshape the relationship between the government and the average person? How did it create, really, the precursor to the modern taxpayer?
Let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To really get why a 1,000-year reform was even possible, we have to look at the system that came before it, which was, to put it mildly, completely unsustainable.
Absolutely. For centuries, the big imperial ideal was always the same. Tax the land.
That makes sense. Land is where the wealth was in an agrarian society.
Of course, they knew land was the immovable source of wealth. The ideology was that the state's power and riches should come directly from the soil. But the practical reality of that,
nightmare.
A total disaster. Can you imagine trying to survey and accurately measure millions of acres across an empire that size with 8th century technology? It was logistically impossible.
So they had to come up with a workaround.
A gigantic, incredibly complex administrative workaround. A system that lasted all the way from the early Han Dynasty right up to the mid-Tang. It was called the Tax and Grain, Labor and Textiles, or the Zuyongdiao.
So how did that work? If they couldn't tax the land directly, what were they taxing?
Well, this is where the state's high ideal met this really messy reality. The whole thing depended on another system, the equal field system.
Okay.
The idea was the state first allocated land to the people. It gave out roughly equal plots to farming families. And because the government was the one handing out the land, they knew, at least in theory, how much land everyone was supposed to be farming.
Ah, I see. So it's a way of creating a record without a massive survey.
Precisely. But here's the crazy part. The Zuyongdiao didn't tax the acreage directly. They taxed the individual. It was a head count.
Wait, a head tax?
Yes. They taxed you because you were a registered adult male in the empire. And that tax, which you paid in grain, in mandatory labor days, and in cloth, that was the state's indirect tax on the land you were supposed to be occupying.
So it's a poll tax, essentially just dressed up as a land tax.
It was an administrative bridge to get to the land's value, and it worked for a while. But it depended on two things that had to be perfect. First, accurate household registration, and second, the state's ability to constantly redistribute land every time someone died or came of age.
And I'm guessing that by the mid-Tang, both of those pillars were wobbling.
They weren't wobbling, they had crumbled, the equal field system was collapsing, you had corruption, local elites grabbing huge estates, and just the sheer impossibility of managing that constant redistribution for a huge population.
So the link breaks. The connection between the person paying the head tax
Right.
and the land they're supposed to be farming, it just snaps.
It snaps. Land gets concentrated in the hands of a few powerful families who, by the way, are great at getting tax exemptions.
Of course they are.
And the common farmers. They become landless tenants working for these big landlords, and they disappear into the countryside.
Which creates a fiscal nightmare for the government.
A total nightmare. If you were a small farmer and you're facing starvation or a landlord is cranking up your rent, what's your best option?
You run. You get off the grid.
You run. You flee the imperial registers. You become what was called a hidden household.
So on the government's books, you still exist. You owe taxes.
Exactly. The official tax records still show you're liable for the grain, the labor, the textiles, but when the tax collector shows up, you're not there, or he can't find you.
They're trying to tax ghosts.
By the 8th century, the official registers showed catastrophically shrinking revenue, even though the population hadn't actually shrunk, they were just hiding. The government was trying to collect taxes from ghost lists, while the real source of wealth, the land, was being worked by tenants who were legally exempt from the old head tax system.
The entire foundation was shattered.
It was fiscally and administratively bankrupt. And since the state couldn't count on people to stay put, the whole approach had to change. They needed a foundation that was, well, literally fixed to the earth.
And this is the moment. This is when our reformer steps onto the stage. Chancellor Yang Yan, serving under Emperor Dazan of Tang, he sees this absolute chaos and realizes the state needs immediate, predictable cash flow just to survive. So in 780 AD, he launches the two-tax law.
And it was a strategic masterpiece of consolidation. It took all those messy, fragmented, old obligations.
The grain you owed, the days you had to go build a canal.
Right, the corvée labor, the rolls of silk you had to weave, all the little local levies. And it synthesized them into one single, unified financial obligation.
So if you're a farmer back then, this must have felt revolutionary. Under the old system, it's like you're getting nagged constantly. You owe 20 days of labor in the spring, a few rolls of silk in the summer, 50 measures of grain in the fall.
Yes, constant harassment from different government departments. Yan Yan's plan was a massive simplification. It was really the ultimate debt consolidation plan for the taxpayers of the empire.
A bill consolidation plan for everyone. Instead of this constant drip feed of obligations, you get 2 predictable lump sum payments a year.
Exactly. And when it was first implemented, they set fixed quotas for the government's revenue needs. This gave the state the stability it desperately needed for budgeting.
But what about for the common person? Was it a heavier burden?
Often no. It actually resulted in a lightening of the overall burden compared to the unpredictable and often abusive demands of the old system.
Especially the labor part, I imagine.
The removal of mandatory corvée duty was a liberation in itself. A local official could no longer just arbitrarily demand you leave your field during planting season to go work on a distant road.
So what happened instead?
Instead, you paid a tax. And if the state needed that road built, it hired paid laborers. This was a huge step toward the professionalization of labor. It was revolutionary.
Okay, but fixed quotas sound great on paper. But doesn't that just open the door to a different kind of problem? If the central government tells a local magistrate, You need to collect X amount of silver. What stops him from collecting X plus Y from the people and just pocketing the Y?
That is an excellent question. And you've put your finger on the tension that plagued all imperial systems. The Liang Shui-fa was definitely vulnerable to this.
Though it wasn't a perfect fix.
Far from it. The central government set the fixed quotas, but local officials were the ones who had to assess the assets the tax was based on. And assessment always leaves room for manipulation.
So a corrupt official could just say, my small plot of land is suddenly worth twice as much.
Precisely. They could arbitrarily hike the assessed value of your land or your other household assets to meet their own inflated collection goals. The reform shifted the site of corruption from dodging labor duty to fighting over property assessment.
Okay. But despite that flaw, it still lasted 1,000 years. So there has to be a bigger aha moment here.
There is. The massive paradigm shift, the thing that cemented its 1,000-year run, was the fundamental object of taxation.
They moved from taxing your existence to taxing your assets.
Absolutely. The old Zuyongdiao was a poll tax. They taxed you simply because you were a registered head in the empire. The Liang Shui-fa introduced, for the first time on this scale, the concept of a property tax.
Your tax burden was now based on your total household assets.
Right. And for the vast majority of people, what was the most important asset?
Land.
Land. The state was finally admitting that counting mobile heads was a futile exercise. People are slippery, they move, they die, they hide. The records are always out of date.
But the land.
The land is the ultimate, faithful, immobile asset. It cannot be moved, it cannot be hidden, it cannot be smuggled across a border. Once the state made that institutional pivot from trying to capture the physical person to securing the physical property, they had finally found a revenue foundation that could endure.
And the name itself, the two-tax law, it sounds so simple. It doesn't refer to two kinds of tax, right?
No, the categories were all bundled into one.
Yeah.
The two refers to the collection schedule. It imposed predictability.
Taxes were collected exactly twice a year.
Once in the summer and once in the autumn.
And that timing was deliberate.
Oh, absolutely crucial. It was aligned with the agricultural cycle. The summer tax was collected after the first harvest, like wheat, and the autumn tax came after the main harvest, usually rice.
Oh, so farmers paid their taxes right when they actually had cash or grain on hand.
Which made it fairer and just more economically logical. This predictability was a huge benefit for the people. You could actually budget your farming year knowing exactly when the state would come knocking.
And for the state, it finally met that centuries-old ideal, a system that was, at least in theory, fair, a tax based on actual land and actual assets.
The philosophical shift was complete. They had moved from a complex, fragile system based on personal servitude and labor duty to a streamlined, property-based system rooted in financial payment.
A reform this radical, this successful, it can't just spring from the mind of one brilliant chancellor, can it? I mean, big administrative leaps like this, they need the right tools and they need the right pressure.
That's exactly right. The forces had to be perfectly aligned. And that's why we have to look at the two catalysts. The technical preparation that made it possible and the political crisis that made it unavoidable.
Let's start with the tools, the technical problem. Land measurement was always the great enemy of accurate taxation. If you can't map who owns what, a property tax is basically worthless.
This is the operational nightmare that sabotaged all the earlier attempts. But fascinatingly, the solution had been developing quietly in the background for centuries, starting way back in the Sui Dynasty.
And it started with something that wasn't even about general taxes.
Not at all. It was the charity granary system, the yikang. This was, believe it or not, a humanitarian measure. It was designed as a local fund for famine preparations.
So like a local food bank funded by a small tax.
A very small supplementary tax. But the mechanism was pivotal. It was levied not by headcount, but based on the amount of land each household cultivated.
So it forced local officials for the first time to start keeping accurate local land records.
Even if the tax itself was minor, yes. The administrative muscle needed to measure and record land was being built up slowly, quietly, under the guise of disaster relief.
And over time, this small tax grew.
By the Tang Dynasty, it had grown significantly. It was eventually renamed the land tax, and its revenue was used for all sorts of general expenses.
So to manage this growing land-based revenue, they needed a better tool, a better ledger.
And that is when they created the critical piece of technology, the Green Sprout Book, the Qin Miao Bu.
It sounds kind of dry, an accounting ledger, but its function was totally revolutionary. What exactly did it do?
It was the definitive register. It meticulously recorded the amount of land held by each household. It noted the quality of that land. Was it high, medium, or low yield? And crucially, it recorded the owner's name.
This is the tool that allowed the government to finally bypass those chaotic household registers, the lists of mobile people, and go straight for the stable, immobile wealth.
It's the ultimate administrative divorce between the person and the property. The state no longer cared where the farmer was, only who is legally responsible for that specific patch of dirt.
This technical capability, built up over generations, must have been the essential foundation. Without the data in the Green Sprout book, the two-tax law would have been just an idea.
It would have been completely toothless. It was the administrative infrastructure that made a real property tax feasible across a massive empire.
You know, this technical preparedness is so often the hidden variable in these huge historical shifts, and has a perfect parallel in Western history, doesn't it?
It does. William the Conqueror's Doomsday Book of 1086.
Right. Same problem, same solution.
The Doomsday Book served the exact same strategic purpose. After conquering England, William needed to know what wealth existed so he could tax it. He sent surveyors across the land to record every asset, every parcel of land.
Because the fundamental principle of effective government is non-negotiable.
You can't tax what you can't count. The King Miaobu gave the Tang state that power.
So the technology was ready. The ledger was there. All that was needed was the political crisis, the external pressure to force them to finally abandon the old, failing system for good.
And that urgency arrived in the form of a cataclysm, the An-Lushan Rebellion in the middle of the 8th century.
This wasn't just a civil war. It was an event that fractured the empire.
It was an administrative and economic fracture that permanently redefined the center of gravity of the Tang Empire. The rebellion just ripped the northern heartland apart.
And even after the government sort of regained control, huge parts of the north were never really the same.
They fell under the permanent, quasi-autonomous rule of regional military governors, the warlords, or fansen.
And the immediate consequence for the emperor in the capital was financial.
Brutally financial. The warlords in the north basically said, the tax revenue from our regions, we're keeping it. They used it to fund their own armies, their own administrations.
So the main revenue stream to the capital was just cut off.
Permanently. The central government's revenue stream narrowed dramatically, forcing it to rely almost entirely on the wealth being generated in the south.
And this is where the crisis really comes to a head. Because the economy of the south looked nothing like the economy of the north that the old tax system was designed for.
Not at all. The south, especially the Yangtze River Valley, had been the site of a massive economic boom for centuries.
Well, what was the economic reality there?
It was dominated by a tenant and employment economy. You had large landholders with vast estates, and the common people worked as tenant farmers or hired laborers.
And here's the fatal loophole.
The fatal fiscal loophole. These people had never received state land grants under the old equal field system. It either never took root there or it had broken down centuries earlier.
And if they never got a state land grant?
They weren't registered in the old Zuyongdiao system. They weren't on the list of people who owed mandatory head tax duties.
So they were structurally exempt from the very tax the state relied on.
Yes. The state was looking at the economic engine of its entire empire, the wealthy, productive South, and realizing the vast majority of its productive population could not be legally taxed under the existing laws. They were financially solvent, but fiscally invisible.
That is a crisis of state survival.
Absolutely. The government couldn't tax the North because of warlords, and it couldn't tax the productive South because of obsolete laws.
The two-tax law wasn't just a clever idea anymore.
It became the only viable, necessary solution. It was the only way to tap into the new economic realities of the empire and save the central government from terminal revenue collapse.
This is perfect storm, a three-way convergence. The technical tool was ready with the King Miaobu.
The economic reality of the South demanded a new system.
And the political crisis of the An-Lushan Rebellion forced the emperor's hand. All three made the reform not just possible, but inevitable. So we've established the moment of creation. Now let's talk about the 1,000-year legacy. How on earth did this system become the unshakable foundation, the fiscal DNA of 4 different dynasties?
It lasted because it did 2 things brilliantly. First, perhaps ironically, it finally realized the theoretical ideal of the imperial state, the pure land tax.
And second,
It also completely revolutionized the citizens' relationship with the government. in a way that actually benefited both sides.
Okay, let's take the first part. Realizing the ideal of a pure land tax.
Right. So when you think about taxing land, economists will tell you there are basically three ways to do it. You can tax the actual production output, how much grain is grown. You can tax the transaction value when the crop is sold. Or you can tax the market value of the land itself.
And given the technology of the 8th century, a market value or transaction tax would have been a non-starter. Way too complex.
Far too complex to manage on a national scale. The empire was really restricted to taxing based on land output or area, which, as we've said, required immense administrative capacity.
And the two-tax law, with the Greensbrat book behind it, finally gave them that capacity.
It moved them much closer to a nuanced assessment based on registered acreage and asset value. But what's fascinating is what happened to it over time.
It changed.
The initial vision of Yang Yan was quite broad. The two-tax law was meant to tax land area and other household assets, things like silver, livestock, even commercial property. They wanted to capture all forms of wealth.
But then came the chaos after the Tang Dynasty collapsed. The 5 dynasties period.
Exactly. Brutal instability.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens during constant warfare? Detailed accounting becomes impossible.
Right. Who has the manpower to go catalog every farmer's silver stockpile when armies are marching all over the place?
It was an administrative luxury that the 9th and 10th centuries just couldn't afford. So all those non-land assets were the first things to become untraceable. The complexity was stripped away by necessity.
And what was left?
Land. It was still visible, still fixed, and still traceable using the ledgers that were already established. So the two-tax law, through the cruel logic of political chaos, ironically simplified itself.
It evolved into a pure land tax.
The centuries-old imperial dream taxation, based purely on the possession of immovable property, was finally achieved. Not through some philosophical breakthrough, but through administrative desperation.
Okay, so that explains the financial stability. But you said the other reason it lasted was the change for the individual citizen, that it was more than just a new balance sheet.
Oh, this was arguably the most profound societal impact. It ended a form of what you could call fiscal serfdom.
Fiscal serfdom. You're talking about the old poll tax system, the Zuyongdiao.
I am. Under that old system, the state demanded your personal labor. It claimed your time, your physical body, your mobility. The citizen was, in essence, bound to the emperor through their physical person.
That constant demand for corvée labor must have been deeply intrusive.
Imagine you're a skilled artisan. The state could just demand you spend 6 months of your year crafting goods for the palace, completely destroying your personal business. The old relationship was one of personal bondage. You owed your very being to the state.
But the two-tax law changed that relationship completely.
It shifted entirely. The state no longer needed your body or your time. It just needed your payment, usually in silver or grain. The relationship became purely fiscal.
You levy a tax based on my property, and I pay that tax. The end.
The end. And this allowed the individual to gain incredible economic agency and mobility. If the state is only concerned with the land tax payment, the farmer is free to decide how he earns that money.
So he could move to a city and become a merchant.
Or he could stay on the farm and invest his farming methods to increase his yields and sell the surplus. It unlocked a wave of economic dynamism.
There's a famous Japanese historian, Naito Konan, who argued this point, right?
Yes, he claimed that the two-tax law essentially liberated the people from the status of slave tenants and kicked off a whole new era in Chinese history, the beginning of a true pre-modern civil society.
It was the birth of the modern taxpayer.
That's a perfect way to put it. The common person transitioned from being a personal servant of the state, defined by physical duty, to a property-owning economic agent whose duty was defined purely by financial debt.
And that new freedom, that new relationship, must have stabilized society.
It created a powerful feedback loop. The state got predictable, secure, land-based revenue. And the people got freedom of movement and economic autonomy. That mutual benefit is why no subsequent regime ever dared to get rid of it.
The endurance is still the most incredible part of this story. How did it achieve that status of untouchable orthodoxy, especially through all the chaos?
Well, its stability was first proven in the most chaotic environment you can imagine. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. That half-century of fragmentation after the Tang collapsed.
Where regimes were rising and falling in the space of a decade.
Exactly. Short-lived, violent, and constantly fighting for legitimacy. And in that fierce competition, what did? They used adherence to the Liang Shui Fa as a profound political signal.
They were telling the people, we're not just bandits, we follow the rules.
We adhere to the legitimate, fixed, and fair financial constitution. We have records of the founder of the Litter and Liang dynasty ordering his officials, outside of the two tax, there shall be no reckless levies.
And there's another one, right?
Yes, Emperor Zhuangzong of later Tang said, the levies of this dynasty shall consist only of the two tax. Even military usurpers who took power by force recognized that messing with this framework was political suicide. It had become the accepted standard of good governance.
The orthodoxy was fixed. So when the later, bigger dynasties came along and stabilized the empire, they didn't abolish it.
They did the opposite. They poured massive resources into making it more accurate and more permanent.
Like the Song dynasty.
The Song understood that the system was only as good as its data. They didn't just collect the tax, which they renamed the summer tax and autumn seedlings. They launched these massive bureaucratic efforts to maintain the land registers.
What did that actually involve?
It involved extensive, comprehensive land surveys. They systematically remeasured, recategorized, and cataloged land ownership across huge swaths of the country. They created these incredibly sophisticated maps and ledgers called U2, or fish scale registers, because the plots on the map looked like fish scales.
That is an astonishing administrative effort, a huge investment just to maintain a tax system.
It shows you it was their lifeline. And then if you jump ahead to the Ming dynasty, the founder, Zuyongdiao, was obsessed with restoring order and reliable revenue. He integrated the two-tax law completely into his new system of governance.
How central was it to the Ming system?
Well, the planned revenue from this one framework, the two-tax, accounted for nearly 75% of the entire formal fiscal revenue of the Ming state.
75%.
Over 27 million shik of grain. I mean, that percentage is the final undeniable proof. This was not just a tax, it was the fiscal engine of the Ming Empire.
Everything else, taxes on salt, tea, commerce, was just supplementary. The entire foundation was the land tax that was first established back in 780 AD.
And that dominance continued right through the final dynasty, the Qing. Despite their own attempts to reform it, the two-tax law remained the core. Qing revenue from this framework almost always accounted for over 70% of formal income. Even when the Qing eventually merged the land tax and the head tax into a single payment, the land area portion, the legacy of the two tax, remained the dominant financial factor.
So this wasn't some desperate, panicked measure from the late Tang, after all.
No, it was the moment that the long-sought ideal of land taxation finally met the technical and political capacity to actually enforce it. It marked the maturity of the imperial system.
A state that finally realized it didn't need to control a person's body to secure its survival. It just needed to control the definition and taxation of their property. 1,000 years of taxation, defining a civilization. So we've seen this monumental shift. The collapse of the head tax, the critical, quiet role of the Green Sprout Book, and the liberation of the common person into a true taxpayer. The state got its revenue, and the individual got a new kind of freedom.
But here's the final thought. If the state only required a financial payment based on property, what other massive non-fiscal freedoms were truly unlocked by this millennium-long foundation? What other, less obvious impacts did the two-tax law have on the ancient empire, beyond just balancing the budget? That's the legacy we'll ask you to mull over.
Until the next deep dive. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.